Hi, this is Drew. You're tuning into an episode with our guest, Dr. Paul R. Hinlicky, who shared a bit about Karl Marx's reception of Martin Luther. Dr. Hinlicky has written about this topic before. And for those who are familiar with Paul R. Hinlicky's work, he is also a host or co host, rather, with his daughter, Dr. Sarah Hinlicky Wilson, of the podcast Queen of the Sciences, the subtitle being Conversations Between a Theologian and Her Dad. And so this episode is being cross-listed on that podcast as well. And so whether you're listening to us through Doth Protest or through Queen of the Sciences, we're very thankful for your listenership, of course, and hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Doth Protest, a podcast on Reformation history and theology. And I'm very delighted today we have Paul R. Hinlicky, Dr. Paul R. Hinlicky, on the podcast. Dr. Hinlicky is a Lutheran pastor, an ecumenical theologian, and an author. He was the Tice Professor of Lutheran Studies at Roanoke College for 22 years and is currently the Distinguished Fellow and Research Professor at Christ School of Theology through the Institute of Theology. Dr. Hinlicky has written and spoke on a range of topics throughout his career. He holds or has held editorial roles for such theological journals as Dialogue, Lutheran Quarterly, Pro Ecclesia, and 16th Century Journal. Some of the titles of the books that he has written are Beloved Community, Critical Dogmatics After Christendom, Divine Simplicity, Christ the Crisis of Metaphysics, Before Auschwitz, What Christian Theology Must Learn from the Rise of Nazism, Luther for Evangelicals, an Introduction, and as well as the Joshua entry for the Brazos Theological Commentary on the Bible. For a full list of the many books and articles he's written, I encourage listeners to go to his website, paulhinlicky.com. It's paulhinlicky.com. Great features of his website include a tab titled Sermon of the Week, where offers free sermons and insights on the lectionary readings that can aid pastors and those with weekly preaching duties in crafting their message. And also on his website, you can find his blog titled Theological Ramblings, which I especially enjoy. And lastly, probably the easiest way to get familiar with Dr. Hinlicky is to go search for the podcast Queen of the Sciences, Conversations Between a Theologian and Her Dad. That is a fascinating and very well done theology podcast by Dr. Hinlicky and his daughter, Dr. Sarah Hinlicky Wilson. It's one of my favorite podcasts, definitely in my top 5 to listen to. And so thank you, Dr. Hinlicky, for being on the show. That was kind of a long introduction, but it was kind of selecting on what to leave out, what to include. And so um,
Thank you, Drew, for that very generous introduction. I'm happy to be with you today.
yeah, absolutely. And of course, our listeners probably, I've brought up Dr. Hinlicky maybe once or twice on the podcast before, just because I've studied with him now for several years at ILT, and he's been very, very thankful and blessed that he's my supervisor in the program. And so this is overdue to have him on the show. And I guess before we get into anything about what we're talking about today, I should say that is it's something Dr. Hinlicky's written in the past. It was an article, I believe it was titled Martin Luther in Karl Marx. Am I getting the title right for that?
Yes, Luther and Marx, yeah.
Luther in Marx, right? And it's basically how Marx, I guess what Marx gleaned from Luther and how Marx interpreted Luther. And I guess before we get into anything on Marx or either of them, I think it might be very important because, well, first I'll ask this. There's an interesting story, Dr. Hinlicky, you have from I guess your younger student years in this topic. And I guess in the pre-show conversation, you described it as a vague ambition. Um, and I guess if you want to give us the backstory of your interest in Marx's reception of Luther. So,
Well, of course, I cut my teeth on the cultural changes occurring in the 1960s. And that included, of course, the civil rights movement, the experience of the assassinations of the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King, the war in Vietnam and the protests against it. And when I was a freshman at Bard College, I used to fill in the return address on my envelopes when I was sending letters home to my family. And I would spell out the United States of America with a K at the end, America, in order to indicate my dissatisfaction with the political state of the United States in 1970 under Nixon's constant escalations of the war in Vietnam. Um, and so forth. And, and that was an exposure there. I went to Bard College, an Episcopalian school by tradition, in 1970, where we had a real live Marxist-Leninist with the bullhorn exhorting us to march in Poughkeepsie against the war, to travel down to Poughkeepsie for protests and so forth. And by the time I finished seminary some years later, in 1977, I think. Um, I was in reaction against the fundamentalist turn of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in which I'd grown up, and my head was full of Paul Tillich and and Rudolf Bultmann, and I had just read Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, which is the charter document of what we call today the New Left, the
mhm.
the post Marxist Leninist Marxism, of so-called humanistic Marxism in Germany. After the working class went for Hitler, Marcuse said, no, we need a new kind of Marxism synthesized with Freud that turns away from class conflict to race and gender conflict as its primary focus. So anyway, all of this was in the air. You know what I'm saying? It was just
Mhm.
the air we breathed in the early 70s, mid 70s. And I started at Union Seminary, of course, which always had a tradition of being on the progressive left with the legacies of Niebuhr and Tillich there and so forth, and others, of course. Um, but I was invited down to the salon, the soiree, I don't know what to call it, that Richard John Newhouse would host in his lower Manhattan apartment building for the clergy affiliated with him throughout Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens. It was a big drinking party every, couple of Wednesday nights or whatever it was, I don't remember. But I was invited and I went with another pastor to it. And so Newhouse was always gracious and wanted to get acquainted with new people at his salon. And at one point, he turned to me and asked me what I was doing at Union and what I was interested in. And I told him, well, I want to synthesize Luther and Marx by way
Mm.
of Tillich. And he looked at me and with a perfectly straight face said, that's not very promising. Did an about face and walked away from me, leaving me hanging there.
Now, was this back when Newhouse was a? Because I know in the 60s and 70s he was very much progressive, or what would be progressive for that time, and was for this pro civil rights, and
Right,
but of course he later became the First Things founder, I think, right, and is usually seen as a
exactly.
neoconservative. What phase was he in when I don't know? I'm just curious when he made those remarks to you.
He was in the middle of his transition between
Ah,
those
okay.
two phases because he always claimed that he hadn't changed. It was the left that had changed. And
Hmm.
he was really appalled by the support for free access to abortion
Hmm.
that was building on the side of the left. And
Hmm.
he said, look, I was against the napalming of babies in Vietnam. I'm not going to support this quiet napalming of babies in the United States. I'm just reporting. That's how Newhouse thought about
Right.
his transition.
Right. Um, well, I guess before we get into anything about Marx, I think it might be important because, the name Marx and terms like Marxism are very charged words in our discourse. I mean, Marx or Marxism is never really discussed neutrally. Well, maybe in the academy, but but not so much in popular rhetoric. And I think one of the things that when you're interested in that you wrote on Marx is what you wrote about really brackets out that noise. Or you were in your writing, you were intentional to bracket out the noise that comes after Marx and to focus just on Marx himself. It's not an apologetic for Marx, but it's not. I don't. You're not saying only if socialists and communists got Marx right, right? We know that refrain, but you seek to understand Marx on his own grounds, apart from perhaps any later school of Marxism. I'll start with bringing this up. For those with any basic understanding of where Marx was coming from, with what is probably one of the most basic Marxian ideas of being dialectic materialism, this idea of this dialectic is um, for those who know, is it's developed out of Hegel. There's this trajectory from Hegel through Marx of this, and Marx takes this over in his own way. One of the courses that I know you've taught in the past, Dr. Hinlicky, is at ILT is on left Hegelianism or left wing Hegelianism, and it's not a course I've taken under you, but I know your familiarity with it, so I'm curious. Uh, this left Hegelianism, this ideological strand that descends from Hegel, as I understand it, and includes notably Ludwig Feuerbach.
Right.
Marx had things to say about religion, yes, but perhaps how we sometimes associate Marx's views with of religion may reflect more. Does it reflect more of these later people like left Hegelians rather than Marx necessarily? Um, I think knowing about or touching a little on that, Feuerbach, the left-wing Hegelians, how did um, how did they depart from Marx? And when we hear about what Marx's views on religion, are we hearing more where Marx was coming from or them?
Well, I think it's a continuum, Drew. The continuum begins with Hegel um, historicizing transcendental idealism. That's the move to dialectical materialism, right?
Hmm.
And so Hegel sees the whole course of human history as the complex dialectical, that is, sic et non, back and forth, two steps forward, one step back, kind of progression through history of the idea of universal humanity in union with the divine. And that's the overriding self-externalization of what Hegel calls Geist, which can, a very ambiguous term in German. It can mean spirit. It means literally in English spirit. It's behind the English word ghost, Geist, ghost, right? And does he mean the divine spirit in the Christian tradition, or does he mean something like the collective consciousness of mankind? And so those are interpretive options that Hegel, I think, rather deliberately leaves kind of ambiguous.
Hmm.
He
Um,
doesn't want to get in trouble with the Prussian censors.
okay.
And
Um, I'm
so let,
sorry. I
let
didn't
me
mean to cut you
just,
off.
yeah, let me just say then,
Yeah.
Feuerbach, at the end of Hegel's life, most of his disciples then, from his own lifetime, became known as the right-wing Hegelians. And they were the ones who wanted to interpret Hegel as Lutheran Protestant Christianity continued by other means.
Hmm.
How do you continue with Protestantism after the Enlightenment? Well, Hegel shows us how. And so that was right-wing Hegelianism, which was basically a kind of strong idealism.
Hmm.
Feuerbach is the one who blew the whistle on all this. Uh, in the 20th century, it was Alexandra Koyave who said that Hegel's Phenomenology was the most atheist book ever written. But that was anticipated by Feuerbach, um, who was made the basic argument that um, um, all religious language is the alienated projection of the lost human essence. So if I am crippled by poverty, I imagine a rich God who can enrich me. If I am crippled um, by feudal overlords, I project a God who can be a knight in shining armor coming to deliver me. And you can go on and on and on through various notions of human oppression. Interestingly enough, the source material for Feuerbach was Martin Luther. He was getting all this humanity of God discourse from Martin Luther and saying, really, this is not about God becoming human. This is about human beings inventing God, right? And so that was the essence of Christianity that Feuerbach wrote. Well, one of Marx's earliest written records we have is his theses on Feuerbach, in which he said Feuerbach's criticism of Hegel is abstract and it doesn't go far enough. And it was in this milieu that Marx emerged as an outspoken atheist. Now, one more complication before I stop. Even though Marx was an outspoken atheist, saying that there's no such thing as a deity or a Christian God, even though he was an outspoken atheist, um, he had a much more complex view of religion. You might remember the famous theses uh, from the Communist Manifesto. Religion is the heart of a heartless uh, world, the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. And what that means is, like a narcotic, religion gives oppressed and suffering humanity a temporary relief. It's a pain reliever, but it only addresses symptoms. And in fact, if you get addicted to this opium, you will never find the courage to stand up and fight for your liberation, right? So it's the opium of the people in a double sense. It relieves from pain, but it also puts you to sleep so that you cannot activate your own humanity. And that's kind of the launching point of Marx's mature thought.
So it would be like someone morphine is good for someone in critical last stages of cancer on their deathbed, but it's good for that situation. Would he say religion is good for, even though I don't really buy it, I don't take it seriously, it's not real, but at least it has this medicinal purpose. But the main point is that we should get rid of these conditions in the first place. Is that kind of Marx's that would
Yeah,
call
that's basically the Marxist line. But Marx himself, I mean, he had this compassion, this feeling for, this sympathy with the sigh of the oppressed that he sees at the root of religions. Now of course, for Marx, the ruling class, the capitalist class, promotes religion because it works as a narcotic, and so they they're patrons of religion, but for nefarious purposes.
Yeah, you mentioned in your work how well, I first maybe we should start with Engels, because you say how in comparison to Engels, Marx read Luther more, you say perceptively. Now when it comes to Engels, I guess we'll back up and kind of spend some time on him if that's okay.
Sure.
You point out in Engels himself, who's very much, anyone who's read, I don't know if it was Das Kapital or Communist Manifest. He was the co-author with Marx on one or both of those. I
The
haven't really read
manifesto,
all.
yeah.
Man, okay. And Engels tried to analogize his struggle with more moderate forms of like socialism or social democracy, with Thomas Munster's misgivings with Martin Luther. This is an interesting, I think, parallel he tries to draw between his own historical situation, Engel's situation of being an ardent communist, I guess, versus more incremental or moderate, Menshevik types, if you will, of socialism. It's an interesting parallel he's trying to draw with him, and then a situation 400 years prior with Thomas Munster, who's on the on the side of peasant uprising, and he's the radical reformer, and Luther's the one who's not who's trying to say, like, let's calm down a little bit here. Munster being the true radical and Luther being the mere upholder of the status quo is, I is so where does Engel go wrong there though? Is with because what does he call Luther? A lackey of the princes?
Yep. Hmm.
Where is Engels really mistaken though when it comes to well, not just with Luther, but why would this not be a proper analogy? Yeah, I guess there's many reasons why this wouldn't be a proper analogy for him to make, but I guess if you could speak to that.
Sure. Let's first of all just do a little contextualization here. What's interesting about Friedrich Engels is that his father made a fortune in the textile, I believe in the textile industry, and Engels inherits all this capitalist wealth, which bankrolls his career as a revolutionary and as a sponsor of Karl Marx's research. So there's a little bit of irony packed into that right
I feel
away.
like that's the story for a lot of revolutionaries in history. His
Yeah.
capitalist daddy paid for it. But I'm sorry, I'll let you go ahead.
But just an irony to be noted
Yeah,
in passing. You have to wonder, how did Karl Marx survive with his wife and family all those years while
similar
he was
story.
working in the
Yeah,
museum library in London? He was bankrolled by Engels, who
you're
had family
right.
wealth. Um, anyway, Engels himself um, came from a part of Germany, and his background was not Lutheran but Reformed. And there's some slight indications that his hostility to Luther reflects those traditional rivalries in
Mm,
German Protestantism. But that's a minor theme there. Really, what Engels did was rehabilitate the reputation of Thomas Munzer and begin the process of viewing Munzer uh, as uh, a forerunner of communist revolution. Um, Now, to do that, he has to, of course, do quite a um, hermeneutical job on on Thomas Munzer. What's interesting about Thomas Munzer is that, first of all, he was a student of Martin Luther in Wittenberg, and that Luther was influential in getting Thomas Munzer his first call as a pastor.
mhm,
So Luther regarded Munzer as a disciple. And somehow Munzer came under the influence of Nicholas Storch and others of these early spiritualists who were basically with the message that new visitations of the Spirit would supersede traditional reading of the Bible,
mm,
indeed, would supersede reading the Bible itself in some ways. And Munzer became convinced through this immediate experience of the Spirit, so claimed, that he had an insight into the real storyline of Scripture, which was violent revolution against the feudal overlords. And we can see in the anti-imperialist themes in the Bible where Munzer might have gotten this line of thought, but Engels was lifting this up. So the heart of religion is not even the sigh of the oppressed in a heartless world. The heart of religion is agitation for the violent overthrow of the oppressor class.
mm.
And so Munzer became convinced, and Engels was arguing in his book, The Peasants' War in Germany, that this is the first rumblings of what was to come as the communist revolution. I think,
Wow.
like I've explained, it requires quite a makeover of the historical Thomas Munson.
Right, yeah. Eh, and you you say Marx read him, was I guess really pierced to the heart of what Luther of writings of Luther um better than what um better than how Engels perhaps read the Luther, at
Yeah,
least the situation of Munster and Luther. Marx
right.
took a special interest in a particular writing of Luther in 1524, I think often known as Trade and Usury, or is it
Right.
Commerce and
Trade and usury. Yep.
Usury?
Hmm.
And you and I guess the that term needs to find it because I went back to Luther's works and I read this writing, this writing that Marx seemed to resonate a lot, this writing from Luther. Usury, the term at least today, is defined as lending money and charging like an unreasonable rate of interest, one that someone could say is like immoral. Um, I don't know. It seemed to me like that was uh, maybe not exactly, but close to the definition of what of the usury that Luther is writing against. But I found it fascinating to go back and read that. I guess it was a treatise, because Luther's living in a period of history that is really the dawn of capitalism, and it may be even if it's fair to even say that yet. And but the landscape is changing, and the nature of trade is expanding in new directions, and that it was thought necessary to make money off of interest in order for this to even work. And yeah, I guess my question was like, what like in this 1524 work where Luther is tackling this topic of usury, and by usury does he mean like any kind of charging of interest, or um is it really just against unfair lending? I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, yeah,
I
what
think that,
mm,
of course, nowadays we would talk about something like predatory lending,
yeah.
something along those lines. Um, but I think Luther is actually um, rather more radical about this than that. He thinks any kind of lending is wrong for a Christian.
Yeah, that's
Give them their cloak, lend without expectation of return. He takes those words of Jesus about self-giving and possession-giving love of the neighbor in need quite literally. Um, and he thinks that this is a categorical obligation on all Christians. So, he's not very good if you're looking for a representative of early capitalism
no,
or
he's not.
early, and of course we have to. This is what's so hermeneutically complex here. You have to understand Luther in the context of his own times on a practical policy issue like usury, right? And he doesn't like the accumulation of capital. He doesn't think that making money off of money through interest is productive in any sense. Now, he's probably empirically wrong about that, but that's what he thinks. He thinks that
Right,
there's nothing productive about, and production matters to him because that's how the economy provides goods and services to neighbors in need. And
right.
so you're exploiting the basic economic relationships of life on the earth if you start charging any kind of interest on money. Um,
Mhm.
so I think that Luther is, a late medievalist in this respect. He's not an early modernist.
Yeah, I found that it was it's so unlike most of the writings we read from Luther, which are usually lectures on like scripture or sermons. And he does, he will write the occasional treatise or, on the occasion that calls for it. But, I found it interesting. It seemed to me that Luther had, yeah, like you said, that understanding that's very conditioned by the time he lived. I thought it was interesting that this was like the transition period from mercantilism to
Right.
capitalism. And also, he isn't so much speaking from the standpoint of like an economic professor, obviously, certainly not a modern one, but as a Christian pastor. And so he's um, But for instance, there's a line in there where he says, "How few merchants would be, and oh, how trade would decline." If people were to realize that the primary and only reason for selling anything or for selling any good is to serve one's neighbor. And I guess
Hmm.
I'll confess, it seems that Luther just seemed a little bit rude and like just his understanding of things. And maybe it's easy from my point in time later on in history to see it as kind of simplistic and crude, his understanding of like how the economies work. But maybe Luther's onto something, because we're seeing now, I mean, nowadays from both the left and the right, we're seeing critiques of criticism of NAFTA, or like how globalized trade has reaped havoc in regards to certain things, uh, just as much, or if not more, you could argue, than it's reaped benefits in regard to others. So maybe Luther was being prophetic or touching on something very real.
Well, sure. I think
You
that
know.
you can, what you can ethically generalize from Luther's tirades, and it wasn't just this treatise drew in 1524. Uh, Luther repeatedly published on the theme of usury and repeatedly called on pastors to preach against usury throughout his entire life. So this
Mhm,
was not a Johnny One Note for him. He sang this song all through his career. Um, but I think what you can generalize from it theologically is that economic justice, however we are going to empirically flesh that out and philosophically and theologically understand those terms, economic justice. And I think there's a lot of questions here, um, right? But the topic of economic justice is a matter of vital Christian concern and social responsibility. I think that's what, and also the suspicion that the rich and the powerful will use their power to make the rich richer and the poor poorer.
mhm,
And that's just built in structurally to the dynamics of wealth accumulation. And that's what Luther finds ethically intolerable.
mhm.
If you are wealthy, it's because God has blessed you. And if God has blessed you, it's in order for you to be a blessing to others and not to build a bigger barn to store your goods, you fool. This night your soul will be taken from you. And then what will happen to your bigger barn with all your goods? I mean, that's Luther's attitude towards questions of economic justice. And I think that's what Marx really uh, seizes a hold of.
Mhm.
He seizes a hold of Luther's. I think he calls it something like his naive polemic against economic exploitation,
Mm.
and he appreciates Luther's railing against economic exploitation as an actual spiritual precedent to his own analysis of 19th century industrialism slash capitalism.
Marx had the I want to ask you more about like how what was it in is particularly the 1524 writing that Marx found so helpful. But I think Marx had the realization of history as a dialectical process, which for him was manifest in class struggle. I know that dialectic was something different for Hegel, but there is struggle for an ultimate. And you say that Marx, whether he knows it or not, is indebted to the biblical narrative, because
Mhm.
of perhaps is where there is, because there is a teleology here, right?
Right.
This idea that history is going somewhere, and so you say he's indebted to the biblical narrative, particularly the apocalyptic understanding that we get from the Bible that Marx inherits. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's a kind of, there's a tension in the Bible, I think, between salvation history and apocalyptic. Salvation history would be the idea that from the beginning God has a plan, and through dispensations, God progressively is realizing that plan from Genesis to the book of Revelation. It's a ongoing unfolding of the divine plan. And somehow then that, for Christians at least, that plan is clarified and fully implemented in the event of Christ and what follows from that. And then that salvation history line, of course, then gets secularized in Hegel. Hegel's philosophy of religion um, um, is basically, or his philosophy of history is basically a secularization of that biblical salvation history, that the dialectical process of history, which, the cliche from thesis to antithesis to synthesis, which then creates a new thesis, which is met by a new antithesis, and then a further synthesis, and so on infinitum. But that process is leading to, for Hegel, the full incarnation of God in the consciousness, in the humanity's universal consciousness of its own unity with divinity. That's the secularized kingdom of God in Hegel's thought. And something very much like that is further secularized in Marxist dialectical materialism, because and the dialectic is quite severe, and this is what borderline merges with apocalyptic, because with the triumph of the capitalist class through industrialization and technology, the accumulation of wealth becomes concentrated entirely in the hands of the owning class, the class that owns the property. And the masses are pauperized. They're reduced to no powerlessness. They have nothing to lose but their chains. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You've been stripped of all other loyalties. You've lost your religion. You've lost your nationality. You've lost your gender identities. All of this has been ground into the dirt and abolished by the juggernaut of capitalism. And as a result, the impoverished and pulverized working class has no more partial claims of loyalty. And it can potentially then become the universal class. It won't be divided by religion or nationality or any other kind of partial consciousness. And when that revolutionary workers class arises to expropriate the expropriators, to take over the means of production from the capitalist class, then the universal humanity um, can um, can be realized, and we'll all have conquered nature through industry and technology, but the benefits will be distributed to each according to their need, from all according to their ability, right? So you have the workers' paradise that's now been created, and humanity will be able to live the rest of its life eating grapes and writing poetry. That's kind
Yeah.
of the eschaton for Marxism, the secularized eschaton.
Yeah, and I feel like obviously we not to rub Marx's nose in the dirt, but of course we saw how history has played itself out since then, and I guess um the secular utopian dream that never actually really came true. But something I do appreciate that you point out is that whatever one wants to think about Marxism, and I think we could both here acknowledge the failure, like I just said, the failures of realizing it, and whether through the Eastern Bloc totalitarians who tried to kind of, you could argue, I mean, harness the dialectical process into their own hands, or if it's more, even if it was the more orthodox Marxists, um, who who their predictions didn't come true either, while maybe having some good insights that endured. Ultimately they were wrong about how history has played itself out, but nevertheless, something you point out is that looking at Luther through Marx can be valuable in our understanding of Luther. What does I think you spoke a lot to what Marx brings to light in his reading of about Luther and his reading of Luther. And there's if there's anything else on that, like feel free to share as well. But I mean he could, but even if Marx is reading Luther one-sidedly or selectively, or conveniently, he does recognize that, I think, as you point out, that Luther sees a problem in something, not just an economic system per se, but something much deeper, the susceptibility of humans to desires that can create larger systems of injustice, if that makes sense.
Yep.
But they both believe in something that will overthrow these large, powerful dark forces. And maybe the answer for this is easy, maybe it's not. I don't know. I'd love to hear how you describe it. Where do they diverge then? Do they both believe in that something will overthrow it? But what for them? Where do they differ on that?
Yeah, great. Uh, Let me respond to a number of things you said there, Drew. First, this. I used to remind my students, I taught this material, to college students for many years at a time when, after 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, when there was a consensus. Marxist Leninism has failed, it's collapsed, it's not credible any longer. The philosopher Fukuyama wrote an essay called The End of History and said basically Marxism, Leninism is discredited. The future of the world is liberal democracy and free market capitalism and globalization. Well, that narrative of Fukuyama hasn't played out so well in the last 30 years, has it?
Mhm. Right.
And history isn't over. And I used to warn my students that Marxism is always waiting there in the wings to make a comeback. And all it takes is Western arrogance, complacency, and naivete about the suffering masses of the two-thirds world.
Mhm.
And I think basically we're seeing a lot of that happening right now in present history, that Marxism is making a major comeback ideologically.
Yeah.
So that leads to the kind of in the article I wrote that you've been referencing, which is in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Martin Luther, and the title of the article is Luther and Marx.
Yeah.
When I came to that conclusion of that study, I asked the question, um, because Marx borrows Luther's moral outrage at economic justice and deploys it rhetorically in support of his own cause in the pages of Das Kapital, right?
Mhm.
Um, to me, that leads to two insights. The appeal of Marxism, urge, has never been that dialectical materialism is all that compelling a theory of economic and social development. The moral appeal of Marxism is that in a secularized world that no longer believes in the Christian God, the moral outrage sponsored by the Jewish and Christian traditions at economic injustice gets a new voice and form in Marxism.
Mhm.
And it's really always been the moral critique of economic justice that drives the passions of people who affiliate with Marxism. I don't think shouldn't be a very controversial thesis,
Oh no,
except,
I agree. I think, but for the people I've observed who have the person here and there who really latches on to Marx and maybe is even a self-avowed Marx, it's always it's always very moral. It's a very moral vision they have. They're not, they're not really interested in talking about dialectical processes. Maybe some are, but that's more of maybe the more academic types. But the activist mind is very moral for sure.
well, actually, Drew, the dialectical side and the moral side are in some tension with each other. Because if you follow Marx's dialectical theory, um, you can't skip a historical epoch. You have to
Right.
go through capitalism and its exploitation in order to fund the development of the technology which is going to conquer nature, and that will eliminate the tragedy of humanity on the earth all these millennia,
Right.
that it's been a war of humanity against nature. Nature doesn't care for human well-being. Human beings must conquer nature in order to have well-being. And you can't skip like the Soviets tried to do and the
Right.
Chinese have tried to do. You can't just jump over capitalism into socialism. And when
Right.
you do, you create horrendous oppression and impoverization. And wherever, like modern China has become prosperous, when it jettisoned Marxist dogma and allowed capitalism to develop under state control in the last 30 years. Now, of course, Xi is trying to reassert communist control over the economy. But anyway, the point is, if you're a dialectical materialist, the moral critique of capitalism is moot. It makes
Hmm.
you can rave against capitalism all you want. You need it in order to get there.
It's a
You know,
necessary step.
it's a
Yeah.
necessary step.
Yeah.
But
Um,
again, uh, if Marx borrows from Luther the moral critique of economic injustice, then I think, as I concluded my article, Luther, so to speak, has the right to make a theological critique of Marx.
Dr. Hinlicky, what would that Luther's theological critique of Marx be, even though we don't, have him he's not a contemporary of Marx. He left this mortal life before Marx entered this world. But what can we fairly say about how what and perhaps it's us what we can learn from Luther and how we could critique Marx perhaps. Well, what would that critique be?
Yeah, it's a kind of an imaginary juxtaposition, but I think it's well grounded in the sources that Marx wanted humanity, the human race, the proletariat, the revolutionary class, to acquire divinity. He wanted humanity to become God without the creator, redeemer God of the Jewish and Christian traditions, right?
Hmm.
He wanted to be God without God. That's in a way, a capsule summary of the demonic temptation to the first couple in Genesis chapter 2. Sicut eritus Deus, you shall become as God, right? You shall become God. And and so, I mean, this is kind of really kind of a theologically basic.
Hmm.
Um, God is God and we are not. God is creator and we are creatures. We are not little gods striding upon the earth. And collectively, when we try to become gods without God, we institute the most vile forms of human oppression. As my years living in post-communist Czechoslovakia um, demonstrated to me, the cynical statement I heard from so many survivors of the Marxist-Leninist regime. Yeah, we're all equal, but some are more equal than others.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know you kind of before we move on to the next thing, you taught in Slovakia for what kind of general period? Was it during the Cold War still, or was it shortly after, or
After 1993 to 1999, I was there for 6 years.
and had it been like were you part of an effort of launching, or because my understanding is that there, probably depending on where you were in the Soviet Union, there was theological study. A lot of it may have been underground. There was the repression of it. I don't know this situation of
Yeah, I
Slovakia,
can
but
I can briefly say that the strategy of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia was slowly to strangle the churches to death by limiting educational opportunities, by steering incompetent people into the ministry of the church, by co-opting the leadership of the church in all sorts of various ways.
mm,
Um, and when communism fell, after 1990 and so forth, there was just this massive influx of youth into the church, all curious um, to learn about the Christian faith, which had survived through the ministries of the babushkas, the grandmas, who would secretly baptize the children and secretly tell them Bible stories and things like that. And
Mhm.
so when I went there in 1993, and being an American and an English speaker, and also having a Slovak heritage, these young people flocked to me, and they were so hungry to learn. And of course, in their polemical antithesis to the atheist Marxist regime, a lot of them had a very fundamentalistic theology of a simple black and white either or.
Mhm.
And I helped them negotiate that in a little bit more mature and balanced way, I think, as I've tried to explain in this whole podcast.
They were fighting fire with fire, perhaps.
E-
Fundamentalism with one fundamentalism for another. So
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, I something you said earlier. I know we have little bit of time left, and we'll get going shortly. But you brought up a good point. You were teaching and around when the Berlin Wall fell. I was around too. I was pretty young, but I belong to a generation that's born towards the end of the Cold War. You could maybe call them post-Cold War. The Cold War is not really in like living memory. Um, but we were of age and very, conscious of the world in 2008. And if, you could say if 89 proves the Marxist project a failure, you could say 2008 could be that equal critique of capitalism. And so I think that's a
Right.
good or global, neoliberalism, perhaps. If
Right.
I know that it's a loaded term, but so I think that's a very fair point to make. For me, it's interesting because in the just the past few years, kind of like in the pre-show conversation, how I'm reading Nazi German history in depth for kind of the first time in my life due to just the direction my studies on with you have tended to go. I've also, read uh, Russian and Chinese histories too, and more so in the past few years because they either weren't part of my program of study and you don't really get so much of that history growing up in a lot of schools. So it's, I guess all to say, I don't know where I'm exactly going with this, but a lot of us are tempted to a lot we're all moral creatures, and of course we do vote for who we vote for, probably in large part based on our morality and have our beliefs based on that. But it does help to know the full picture all the time and to know that all these systems and ideologies um, have long histories, and they're all fallible. And so yeah, I think that's a good point you brought out with kind of the Fukuyama quote. So
Yeah.
um, well, yeah, thank you for your time, Dr. Hinlicky. I look forward to meeting with you again soon, and thanks for coming on the podcast for this. And this episode will be cross-listed with Queen of the Sciences, the podcast Dr. Hinlicky, both Dr. Hinlicky's uh, host or co-host together. And so we're very appreciative for us being cross-listed with them. It's a great podcast, and we're excited to have this be shared with their listenership as well. So thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Take care, and we will see you next time. God bless.